I thought my own sibling was stealing from me, but it turned out to be more complicated than that, for it was something planned by creep criminals. Growing up, my brother Jake and I were like night and day, and he was the wild, adventurous one who always pushed boundaries, while I was the rule-following older sibling, always cleaning up the mess he left behind. When we were kids, our differences were the cause of countless arguments, but I never imagined how far apart life would eventually take us. After our parents passed away a few years ago, the little contact we had dwindled. Jake couldn't seem to settle down or hold a job, and every few months he'd show up at my apartment asking for a place to crash. I let him stay because he was family. What else was I supposed to do? But having Jake around was like living with a hurricane. At first it was small annoyances, leaving dirty dishes everywhere, never replacing the toilet paper. Then it became bigger things, like beers disappearing from the fridge. I chalked it up to Jake being Jake. But when my wireless headphones vanished, followed by cash I'd tucked away in a drawer, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The breaking point? My laptop charger was gone the same week Jake asked if I could lend him money again. Suspicion boiled over. "Jake," I confronted him one night, "are you stealing from me?" His reaction was explosive. He denied it, called me paranoid, and stormed out of my apartment. A part of me felt relief. At least I wouldn't have to deal with his chaos anymore. But the story didn't end there. The first few days after Jake stormed out were surprisingly calm. The apartment felt cleaner, quieter, almost serene. For the first time in months, I wasn't walking on eggshells or dealing with his chaos. But that sense of peace didn't last long. It started with little things, the kind of details you'd second-guess yourself over. One evening, I noticed the kitchen window was unlocked, even though I could have sworn I'd latched it earlier. A sandwich wrapper was left on the counter, though I didn't remember making anything. Then the missing money. Again. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd been careless. Maybe I'd miscounted. But deep down, the nagging suspicion lingered. Jake had denied stealing from me. But could I trust him? Determined to find answers, I bought a small, inexpensive security camera and tucked it away discreetly in the living room. I didn't expect much. Just a chance to catch Jake red-handed if he decided to sneak back in. The following morning, as I reviewed the footage, my stomach dropped. The grainy video revealed someone slipping through the kitchen window in the middle of the night. But it wasn't Jake. The intruder was a stranger, dressed in dark clothing, moving with unsettling purpose. They went straight for the dresser in my bedroom, rifling through it as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. After only a few minutes, they slipped back out, leaving my apartment in eerie silence. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a random break-in. Whoever this person was, they had been here before, and I had blamed Jake the whole time. Feeling a wave of guilt and dread, I picked up my phone and called him. The conversation was strained, my apology spilling out in a flood of words. Jake listened in silence as I explained what I'd seen. When I finished, his response wasn't what I expected. Jake hesitated, then admitted he'd noticed something odd during his time crashing at my place. A man, hanging around outside my building, lurking near the entrance late at night. Jake had even confronted him once, but the guy took off before anything could happen. Jake's revelation hit me like a second blow. All this time, while I'd been accusing him, he'd been watching out for me in his own way. Jake's revelation stayed with me, unraveling everything I thought I knew about the past few months. The image of a stranger lingering near my building, watching, sent chills through me, and the thought that Jake had confronted him, without saying a word to me, made me question everything I had assumed about him. Reflecting on the time Jake spent at my place, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. Sure, he was messy and careless, and his constant need for help was exhausting. But there was another side of him I had overlooked, a side that noticed things I hadn't and quietly acted without expecting thanks. That evening, Jake called again. His tone was measured, almost somber, as he explained how he'd first noticed the man. It started innocuously, someone loitering near the entrance late at night, blending into the usual city bustle. But over time, it became clear the guy wasn't just passing through. He was always there, always in the same spot, his eyes fixed on the building like he was waiting for something. Jake admitted he had confronted the man one night, asking why he was there. The response was vague, almost dismissive, but Jake hadn't liked the way the guy bolted afterward. It wasn't fear. It was the calculated retreat of someone who didn't want to be caught. Hearing this, I felt a knot of guilt tighten in my chest. While I'd been jumping to conclusions and blaming Jake for every small inconvenience, he had been quietly watching out for me. It was a sobering realization, one that made my earlier accusations feel painfully unfair. Later, Jake came by to help secure the apartment. We reinforced the windows, installed additional locks, and set up another camera to cover the back of the building. He worked methodically, not saying much, but there was no mistaking his resolve. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Jake had been right to worry, and now the pieces were starting to form a bigger, darker picture. This wasn't a random series of break-ins. Someone had been targeting me, watching me, learning my routines. While we were packing a few essentials in case the situation escalated, a sound outside caught our attention. A faint shuffling, just loud enough to break the silence. Jake moved to the window, peering out cautiously. The man was there. He stood just beyond the reach of the streetlight, his figure barely visible against the night. He didn't try to approach or make a move, but his presence was undeniable. It felt like a challenge, a silent assertion that he wasn't going anywhere. The weight of the moment pressed down on us. The air in the apartment felt heavy, charged with a mix of fear and adrenaline. We both knew this wasn't something we could handle alone anymore. Jake reached for his phone, and soon the police were on their way. By the time they arrived, the man had slipped away into the darkness, leaving nothing but the lingering sense of his presence. That night, I realized how deeply I had underestimated my brother. His actions weren't perfect, but they were protective in a way I hadn't fully appreciated until now. Even with the police involved, the sense of security I once felt in my home was gone. They took our statements, listened to what Jake had seen and what I'd captured on camera, and promised to increase patrols in the area. It felt like a procedural reassurance, useful on paper but hollow in the moment. After the officers left, Jake and I sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything pressing down on us. The stranger's lingering presence wasn't just eerie, it was personal. He wasn't after random valuables or taking advantage of an open window. He was deliberate, watching, and waiting. Jake insisted we stay somewhere else for the time being. He didn't trust the added locks or the cameras to be enough. And truthfully, neither did I. I packed a bag of essentials, my hands shaking with the realization that I was fleeing my own home. We booked a room at a nearby motel, small, nondescript, but enough to feel safer. Jake didn't say much during the drive, his focus seemingly locked on the road ahead, but his presence felt like an anchor. The next few days blurred into a routine of tension. I tried to carry on with work, logging into meetings and answering emails as if nothing had changed, but my thoughts were constantly pulled back to the stranger. Jake stayed vigilant, spending hours reviewing the footage from the cameras we'd set up. Each night, he parked himself near the motel window, his eyes scanning the street for anything unusual. Then 2 days later, a new piece of the puzzle emerged. Jake, ever the restless investigator, decided to walk back to my apartment building during the day to check on things. He called me afterward, his voice tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. He had seen the man again, not at the building this time, but loitering a block away near a small cafe. The guy wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, just sitting there, his gaze fixed on a notebook in front of him. But Jake noticed something chilling. The notebook wasn't just any notebook, it was mine. Jake recognized it from the distinctive, brightly patterned cover, one I'd bought months ago and used for journaling. It had disappeared weeks ago, along with the other things I'd initially blamed Jake for. Hearing this, I felt the blood drain from my face. The stranger didn't just know my apartment, he had been inside it, rummaging through my personal things. And now, he was sitting out in the open, carrying around a piece of my life like a trophy. Jake didn't approach him, instead snapping a quick photo with his phone and heading back to the motel. When he returned, we sat together, staring at the blurry image of the man on his screen. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 20s or early 30s, with a wiry build and an unkempt beard. His face was calm, almost unnervingly so, as if he wasn't the least bit concerned about being noticed. We took the photo to the police that evening. They filed it as part of the ongoing investigation, but cautioned us to remain vigilant. They still didn't have enough to act, not without catching him in the act of something criminal. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the motel's thin walls set my nerves on edge, and even with Jake nearby, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sense of safety, of normalcy, felt like a distant memory. The realization that the stranger had been carrying my journal, it was like a punch to the gut. Every page was a snapshot of my thoughts, my routines, my private moments. He wasn't just some opportunistic thief. He was deliberate, calculated, and now in possession of pieces of my life I hadn't even realized were missing. Jake's frustration was palpable. He wasn't one to sit idly by, and watching the police treat this as just another open case was wearing on him. I, on the other hand, felt paralyzed. My instinct was to hide, to shrink away from the whole situation. But Jake wouldn't let me. "We're not just going to wait for this guy to make his next move," he said, pacing the cramped motel room. His voice was firm, with a determination that made me sit up and listen. "We need to get ahead of him." The plan came together slowly, piece by piece, as Jake and I hashed out every detail. The first step was upgrading the security measures at my apartment. We weren't going to reclaim it immediately, but the cameras and locks were just the beginning. Jake insisted on motion sensors and alarms, anything to make the place feel like a fortress. Next, we needed more information. Jake suggested that if the stranger had my journal, there was a chance he was keeping more trophies from other victims. It was a grim thought, but one that gave us direction. Jake planned to watch the area around my apartment, trying to track the man's movements. Meanwhile, I'd dig into local community groups and forums, looking for reports of similar break-ins. The stranger's presence had unnerved us both, but it also made one thing clear. He wasn't invisible. Jake had seen him twice now, and we had his photo. There was a chance, slim but real, that someone else had seen him too. The hardest part of the plan, for me, was the bait. Jake was convinced the man's obsession wasn't random. He was targeting me specifically, which meant we could use that to draw him out. Jake suggested I return to the apartment carefully and with police involvement nearby, while he kept watch from a distance. The thought of stepping back into the apartment made my stomach twist, but Jake's logic was sound. The stranger wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, or until we stopped him first. By the end of the night, I felt something I hadn't in days. Control. The fear was still there, lurking under the surface, but it wasn't the only thing guiding me anymore. Jake's determination was infectious, and for the first time I started to see the bigger picture. And this wasn't just about taking back my apartment or protecting my things. It was about reclaiming my life. The next morning, we put the first steps of the plan into action. Jake reached out to a few trusted friends who worked in private security, borrowing equipment and gathering advice. I spent hours combing through local online posts looking for anything that might connect the dots. And then, just as I was about to close my laptop for the night, I found it. A post buried in a neighborhood safety forum, written by someone in a nearby building. They'd noticed a man matching our description, loitering near their parking lot. The poster mentioned that items had gone missing from their car, but what struck me most was their description of his behavior. Calm, methodical, like he wasn't afraid of being caught. Jake's voice cut through my thoughts. "What did you find?" I turned the screen toward him, my pulse quickening. He's not just watching us. He's been targeting others, too. The discovery on the forum shifted the dynamic completely. The stranger wasn't just focused on me. He had done this before. This realization had made the situation both less personal and far more unnerving. It wasn't about me as an individual. It was about a calculated method he had likely refined over time. Jake wasted no time. He reached out to the forum poster, sending a concise message to ask for more details about their encounter and the stolen items. Hours passed without a reply, but Jake's resolve didn't falter. To him, this was confirmation they were on the right track. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to what came next. Returning to my apartment, it was a daunting thought, but the plan to draw the stranger out was our best chance. The idea of using myself as bait unsettled me, but it felt necessary. With Jake's insistence, I called the police to update them. The officer handling the case was hesitant, but when I mentioned the journal and the forum post, her tone shifted. She agreed to send an officer to patrol the area discreetly when I went back. Preparations consumed the rest of the day. Jake walked me through every possible scenario, reinforcing the new security measures and mapping out a clear exit strategy. His confidence was infectious, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his own anxiety. The next day, I returned to the building with a packed bag and a sense of dread hanging over me. Jake stayed nearby, parked down the street with a view of the entrance, while the police car remained stationed further away, blending into the usual city traffic. Each step toward the apartment felt heavy, the air thick with tension. Inside, the apartment was eerily still. The familiar space felt different, too quiet, too perfect, like it was holding its breath. I scanned every corner, searching for signs of disturbance, but nothing seemed out of place. Even so, the unease lingered. I tried to settle into some semblance of a routine, alternating between busy work and watching the security feed Jake had set up. The hours dragged, every sound amplified in the silence. As night fell, the waiting became almost unbearable. Then finally, movement. Jake's phone pinged with a motion alert from one of the cameras. The stranger was there, hovering near the side entrance to the building. Jake texted a quick warning for me to stay put and let the police handle it, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. Opening the camera feed, I watched as the man paced nervously, his figure illuminated by a single dim streetlight. For several minutes, he didn't attempt to break in. Instead, he lingered, his movements deliberate but cautious. The tension grew with each second, my pulse racing as I studied his every move. Then, as if sensing he was being watched, he stopped. Slowly, he turned his head, staring directly into the camera lens. The smile that spread across his face was deliberate, chilling. It wasn't the grin of someone caught off guard. It was a message. The image of the stranger staring into the camera with that unnerving smile burned into my mind. It wasn't the look of someone who'd been caught off guard. It was calculated, deliberate, as if he wanted me to know he wasn't afraid. Jake acted quickly, notifying the police while keeping his distance. From his vantage point in the car, he had a clear view of the man loitering near the side entrance. The patrol car rolled up moments later, its presence enough to send the stranger retreating into the shadows. But he didn't run. Instead, he strolled away casually, his movements relaxed, almost mocking. Jake followed at a safe distance, keeping the police updated with the man's direction, but the stranger was clever. After a few blocks, he disappeared down an alley, vanishing as if he'd melted into the city. When Jake returned to the motel later, his frustration was palpable. He dropped into the chair by the window, running a hand through his hair as he recounted the chase. The stranger's confidence was unsettling. It was clear this wasn't the first time he'd dealt with being pursued. Over the next few days, things escalated. The man didn't return to the apartment, but his presence seemed to linger everywhere. Jake spotted him again in the cafe near my building, casually sipping coffee as if he belonged there. He wasn't watching the building this time. He was watching people, observing, calculating. And then one night, he left a message. It was Jake who found it, scrawled hastily on the windshield of his car. "You're in over your head. Stop looking." The handwriting was jagged, the letters uneven, but the intent was clear. Jake's reaction was immediate. He showed the note to the police, who took it as further evidence that this wasn't just a random series of break-ins. The officers assured us they were taking the matter seriously, but their cautionary tone suggested they still didn't have enough to take action. For me, the note was a turning point. It wasn't just about protecting my space anymore, it was about reclaiming control. Jake and I spent hours piecing together every scrap of information we had. The forum posts, the encounters, the security footage. It was a fragmented puzzle, but slowly a picture began to emerge. The stranger wasn't after random valuables or opportunistic theft. He had a pattern, a method. The journal he'd taken wasn't just a trophy. It was a map of my routines, my thoughts, my vulnerabilities. And now, with the note, he'd shifted his focus to Jake. It was clear he wanted us to stop digging, but the more we uncovered, the harder it became to turn back. The breakthrough came late one night as Jake reviewed the footage from the cameras around the building. In one clip, taken just hours before the man's first appearance, another figure emerged. A woman. She walked past the apartment, paused briefly near the side entrance, then moved on. At first glance it seemed unimportant, just another pedestrian. But Jake noticed something strange. She appeared again a few minutes later, this time on the other side of the street watching the building. Whoever she wasn't random. Jake's instincts kicked into overdrive, and he combed through older footage, trying to find more traces of her. After hours of searching, he found her in a clip from weeks earlier, walking with the stranger. They weren't just connected, they were working together. The revelation hit us like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just one man, it was a coordinated effort. And now, it wasn't just about figuring out what they wanted, it was about stopping them before they went further. The discovery of the woman shifted everything. She wasn't just a random figure in the footage. Her repeated presence near the building confirmed she was connected to the stranger. This wasn't one person acting alone. It was a coordinated effort. Jake dove into the footage, isolating every instance where the woman appeared. She was methodical, never lingering too long, but her timing wasn't accidental. In one clip, she handed the stranger a small object, possibly my journal. Cross-referencing local crime forums and social media, Jake found a post describing a man and woman matching their descriptions near another building in the area, so sure. Small items had gone missing from cars, and the woman had posed as a potential tenant, asking questions about security. It was clear now. This wasn't a random series of break-ins. They were targeting specific locations, exploiting vulnerabilities, and gathering information. My journal wasn't just a keepsake. It was a tool. With this new lead, we updated the police, who seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. They promised increased patrols and began looking for a vehicle linked to the pair. But the calm didn't last long. Late one evening, Jake caught new footage. The woman was back, speaking with a stranger near the side entrance of my building. Their interaction seemed tense, their gestures sharp and deliberate. Then she looked up at the camera, her gaze lingering before a faint, knowing smile spread across her face. It was a chilling confirmation. They knew we were watching. The woman's chilling smile lingered in my mind long after Jake showed me the footage. It wasn't just unsettling, it was deliberate, a clear signal that they were aware of us. If there had been any doubt before, it was gone now. This was personal. Jake's frustration had boiled over. Waiting for the police to act felt like treading water while the situation grew more dangerous. We needed a way to force their hand or, at the very least, disrupt whatever the stranger and the woman were planning. That night, Jake suggested setting a trap. It wasn't reckless. He'd thought it through, laying out a plan that would minimize risk but increase the pressure on them. We'd use the information we had, their patterns, their locations, to bait them into making a mistake. The first step was identifying the gray sedan the woman had been seen driving. Jake spent hours combing through footage from nearby streets, and finally there it was, a car matching the description parked a few blocks from my building. Jake acted quickly, planting a small tracking device under the car. It was risky, but it paid off. Over the next 2 days, the device revealed a pattern. The car repeatedly returned to a quiet residential area on the outskirts of the city, parking near an older, rundown house. Armed with this information, Jake updated the police, who promised to investigate the property. Still, the waiting was excruciating. We couldn't sit idly by, so Jake decided to use my return to the apartment as bait. This time, we'd control the situation from every angle. On the designated night, Jake set up additional cameras and sensors, covering blind spots around the building. I returned to the apartment under police observation, trying to act as normal as possible despite the tension gnawing at me. Hours passed without incident. Then just before midnight, the motion alert started. The stranger was back. This time he wasn't pacing outside or watching from a distance. He moved with purpose, approaching the back entrance. Jake monitored the feed from a nearby car, texting updates to the officer station nearby. The man's focus was razor sharp. He barely hesitated as he tested the lock on the door, slipping inside moments later. Inside the apartment, I stayed frozen in the bedroom, my phone clutched tightly as I tracked his movements through the camera feed. He wasn't rummaging aimlessly this time. He went straight for the dresser, the place he'd targeted before. The police were ready. Within minutes, officers entered the building, their footsteps echoing through the hall. The stranger heard them. His head snapped toward the sound, but it was too late. The officers apprehended him before he could escape, their commands cutting through the tense silence. Through the crack in my bedroom door, I caught a glimpse of him as they led him away. He didn't struggle. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he smiled. The moment the stranger was led away by the police, I felt a rush of relief, brief and fleeting. Jake joined me in the apartment soon after, his usual confidence tempered by the lingering tension in the air. "He smiled," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. I'd seen it, and Jake had too. That knowing grin, as if this had played out exactly how he wanted. The police assured us they'd question him thoroughly, but the man wasn't talking. Hours stretched into a full day, and all we knew was that he'd given them a fake name and refused to explain his presence or actions. Meanwhile, the tracking data on the woman's car revealed more troubling details. The house she'd frequented wasn't just any property, it was abandoned. No utilities, no listed owner, just a shell of a building. Police who searched it found scraps of paper with detailed notes about me and other potential targets. My name, routines, and even sketches of my apartment's layout were among the findings. But the woman was gone. The tracking device on her car had gone silent, suggesting she'd found it and removed it. Without her, the pieces of the puzzle still didn't fit together. Who were they? Why me? The breakthrough came late that evening. Jake was reviewing the footage of the stranger's arrest when he noticed something odd. As the man was being led out, he looked up at one of the cameras, not with that same unsettling smile, but with something else. A glance. Quick and deliberate. Jake rewound the footage, slowing it down. It was there again. A fleeting gesture, a subtle nod toward the camera. He's signaling something, Jake said, his voice tight with realization. The next few hours were a blur. Jake cross-referenced every camera feed we had, looking for anything out of place. And then, just after midnight, he found her. The woman appeared in the footage from a camera near the street. She wasn't approaching the building, she was leaving. She'd been nearby the entire time, watching from the shadows. By the time we alerted the police, she was long gone. But it was clear now. The stranger wasn't the mastermind. He was bait, meant to draw our focus while she slipped away, leaving behind the pieces of her twisted operation. The police continued their investigation, but for me and Jake, the ordeal wasn't over. Knowing she was still out there with her unsettling precision and calculated moves, left a weight neither of us could shake. I moved into a new place under a different name, cutting ties with the apartment that had once felt like home. Jake stayed close, his protective instincts stronger than ever, though the experience had left its mark on him too. The stranger's smile, the woman's chilling calm, it was all a reminder that not everything could be explained or neatly resolved. Some threats linger in the corners of your mind, shadows that never fully disappear. But if there was one thing I learned, it was this. When the shadows close in, sometimes the person you least expect becomes your greatest ally. Jake wasn't just my brother. He was my protector and my partner in facing the unknown. Together we'd made it through, and no matter what came next, I knew we'd face it the same way, together.